Trolley Yesterday by John Bellairs, Chapter 17. Groaning weakly, Mr. Townsend picked himself up. "Oh, dear. Oh, dear," he moaned as he tottered down the aisle. "I can't imagine what happened. Where do you suppose we are?" The professor glanced grimly at the windows, which were lit with a sullen red glow. "I guess we'd better find out," he said quietly. "The rest of you follow me, and be careful." Fearfully, Mr. Townsend, Johnny, and Fergie lined up behind the professor, who took the pipe tamper from its leather bag and pulled the handle that opened the folding doors. At a touch from the tamper, the blue veil parted, and the four travelers stepped out of the trolley one by one. They found that they were standing on a tiny sandy island where Leander's tower had once stood. But the tower was gone. So was the Sea of Marmara. Its bed was just a deep, undulating valley full of sand and shells, and the ribs of wrecked ships. Across the way where Constantinople had once stood rose the shattered ruins of a modern city. Twisted masses of girders stretched spindly arms into the sky. These were the skeletons of skyscrapers that had been wrecked by some hideous explosion. The city seemed to be abandoned, and the dusky red air had a sulphurous tone. In the coppery sky, ghostly and enormous, hung the moon. It loomed impossibly close to the earth, and its craters and mountain ranges could all be seen clearly. The professor said nothing. He knew that they were looking at some scene in the far distant future. 25th century, 30th century, who could tell? Silently they filed back into the trolley, and the door hissed shut. Without a word, Mr. Townsend knelt down and opened a sliding door under one of the trolley seats. He pulled out a toolkit and went to the front of the car, where he knelt down again and began unscrewing the metal plate that covered the control panel. Behind the plate lay a confusing mass of wires, cams, springs, winking Christmas tree bulbs, rods, and vacuum tubes with glowing filaments. One of the tubes was dark, and Mr. Townsend jerked it from its socket. When he inserted a new one from his kit, the tube glowed, and with a relieved sigh he began screwing the plate back on. Finally he stood up and wiped his forehead on his sleeve. "I think it'll run all right now," he said as he turned to the professor, a sad, apologetic frown on his face. "The fault was mine, all mine. I should never have manhandled the controls that way. I always get upset when someone is looking over my shoulder. Perhaps you had better run this thing." The professor patted Mr. Townsend on the arm and took his place in front of the controls. He set the place dial for Dunstan Heights, and the date and time dials for the day their journey had begun. Then, holding his breath, the professor turned the starting lever to on, and the trolley began to hum and tremble. After a brief hesitation, it leaped forward, back into the past, back to the 1950s. The car hurtled on, rattling and swaying from side to side. Finally it screeched to a halt, and immediately the professor jumped up. He rushed to the side door, pulled the lever, and parted the veil. Then he let out a loud, joyful exclamation. They were back in the dank stone tunnel where their journey had begun. With his valise in his hand, the professor clumped down the iron steps to the ground. Johnny and Fergie followed quickly. Mr. Townsend glanced about in a confused way, and then he gasped in surprise. "Good heavens," he said, "you've unblocked the archway, the one that leads back to the basement of my house. Why ever did you do that?" The professor looked astonished. Why did I—" he began in a wondering tone. "Heavens, man! How else could I have gotten to use your wretched trolley? Do you think—" The professor's voice trailed off, because it had just occurred to him that Mr. Townsend's question meant that the tunnel had been blocked up when he had zoomed off into the past 30 years ago. Unless he had sealed it up on the day he left, which did not seem likely, how had he gotten from his house to the trolley? Mr. Townsend stood watching the professor with his arms folded and a smug little smile on his face. "Let me enlighten you. Come on, right this way," he said. The professor and the boys followed Mr. Townsend up a short flight of cement steps to the subway platform. They watched in amazement as the old inventor reached into the ticket booth and spun the ticket roll 3 times counterclockwise. From deep down under the platform came a slow grinding of gears and a clatter of chains. Slowly the ticket booth began to swing off center, revealing a manhole-sized opening. Cleated iron steps wound down into the darkness. "A secret passage," breathed the professor joyfully. He could hardly contain his delight. "I've always wanted to have one in my house, and now— But tell me, where does it go?" Mr. Townsend smirked. "Follow me, folks, and you'll find out, but be careful, there isn't any handrail." Mr. Townsend carefully picked his way down the spiraling stairs, and the others followed. At the bottom, a level passage stretched out into pitchy blackness. The professor quickly fetched his Nimrod lighter out of his valise, and a spear of yellow flame leaped up, lighting the tunnel. Once again, Mr. Townsend took the lead. After about 50 yards, they came to a flight of wooden steps that led up inside the walls of the professor's house, and they started climbing. Finally, Mr. Townsend slid back a wooden door, and they stepped into a tiny room that the professor knew well. It was his fuss closet. It was a private place in the professor's study, where he went to rant and pound on the walls when he was in a foul mood. For this reason, the little room was padded with gym mats, and on the inside of the closet door hung a sign that read, "To fuss is human, to rant divine." "What on earth is all this?" asked Mr. Townsend, wonderingly, as he looked at the padded walls. The professor was embarrassed. He could feel his face growing red. Well, it's sort of a practical joke. I'll explain it to you sometime. Come on downstairs to the kitchen and we'll have something to drink. It's great to be home." The others agreed, and they followed the professor through the study and down the front staircase to the kitchen. Johnny and Fergie got a couple of Cokes from the refrigerator, and the two men had small glasses of Irish whiskey. After rummaging in his kitchen cupboard, the professor dug out a box of black and gold Balkan Sobrane cigarettes. With a courteous bow, he offered one to Mr. Townsend. "I've been trying to give up smoking," said the professor, as he lit both cigarettes and blew clouds of smoke in the air. "However, we all have our weaknesses. It is so wonderful to be home." He leaned back in his chair, sighed, and let out a loud exclamation. He had just noticed the kitchen clock. "Good gravy!" he exclaimed. "It really is only a few minutes after the time when we took off on this trip. The clock says 9:30. The windows are dark, so—" "It's no coincidence," said Mr. Townsend with a strange smile. "If you set the dials for the time you left, that's when you get back. The laws of time are suspended for time travelers. Hasn't it occurred to you that I ought to be a lot older than I am? I disappeared 31 years ago, and I was in my 50s then. Do I look like an 80-year-old man? Do I act like one?" The professor was stunned. A lot of things had been happening, so he had never really spent much time thinking about Mr. Townsend's age. But now that the subject was brought up, the professor squinted owlishly at Mr. Townsend. "Heavenly days, McGee!" he exclaimed. "Do you mean to say that you haven't grown old at all while you were bumbling around outside Constantinople?" "Bumbling around, indeed," Mr. Townsend said, laughing. "I aged a little, not 31 years, but a bit." He paused and frowned sadly. "But I'm sure I was declared legally dead long ago, and what money I had must have gone to my sister, who lives in Maine. I wonder if she's still living. If she is, I'll go up and stay with her. If it turns out she's dead, perhaps you can take me on another trolley ride and drop me off somewhere in America in the not-too-distant past. I might be able to earn a living predicting things that I know are going to happen." "Well, all you need to do for the time being is rest," said the professor, as he refilled Mr. Townsend's glass. "You're welcome to stay here as long as you like. This was your house, after all." He paused and puffed his cigarette. Then suddenly he threw a sharp glance at Mr. Townsend. "If you don't mind my asking," he said, tapping his friend on the chest with his finger, "how did you get inside the city in the middle of the siege? That must have taken some doing." Mr. Townsend shrugged. "Not really," he said. "I don't remember everything, but I think I got knocked down by a soldier outside the walls of Constantinople. When I woke up, I found that my head was bloody, and I couldn't remember how I had gotten into this field outside the walls." "That was the second blow," said the professor with a grin. "When I met you in the field earlier that day, you already had a head wound, and you thought you were an admiral of Venice. You wouldn't let me help you. The second knock must have come when those soldiers went by. We were sure that you had been killed by them." Mr. Townsend smiled. "Luckily I wasn't. I just picked myself up and walked into the city, through one of the holes that the cannon had made in the walls. Then I wandered around looking for you and the boys, and that insane monk got his hooks in on me. But all in all, I think we're very lucky to be alive." The professor nodded and sipped thoughtfully from his whiskey glass. Mr. Townsend's attention turned to the black valise, which had been dumped on the floor next to the kitchen table. Reaching down, he fumbled about and came up with the flare gun. Its muzzle was blackened, and when Mr. Townsend sniffed, he noticed the acrid odor of freshly exploded gunpowder. "Good heavens!" he exclaimed. "What on earth have you been doing? I know that you used a flare on that Turkish galley that my ship captured, But that was some time ago. It seems you were shooting flares again. Why? The professor coughed in an embarrassed way. It's a long story, he said. I'll tell it to you sometime. I was just trying to change the course of history, but it seems that there was some evil genie in the universe that won't allow you to do things like that. A good thing, too, Mr. Townsend said emphatically. I mean, if people started fiddling with the past, maybe they wouldn't fix it. Maybe they would fix it so you and I don't exist. Then where would we be? The professor thought about this, then he and Mr. Townsend got into a long, boring discussion about time. Meanwhile, Fergie and Johnny had finished their cokes, and they were thinking about going home. On the trip back in the time trolley, they had been cooking up all sorts of fancy explanations to tell their families to explain their long absence. But now they realized that they hadn't been gone long enough to need explanations. Fergie left first. He mumbled a few polite things and ducked out the back door, slamming it behind him. When Johnny decided to go, the professor followed him to the front door. They paused on the porch to sniff the air of the chilly April evening. As Johnny was staring down the front steps, a thought occurred to him. "Oh my gosh," he said, and his hand flew to his mouth. "I forgot all about Brewster. You don't think we left him behind accidentally, do you?" The professor shook his head and laughed. "Not a chance," he said. "Gods of Upper and Lower Egypt know how to take care of themselves. I suspect he'll be sitting on my desk when I go to bed tonight. For all I know, he may be here right now, hovering invisibly. He likes to do things like that." He paused and glanced into the empty air. "Brewster," he said, "are you there?" No answer. "Blasted, overrated hunk of stone," the professor glowered good-naturedly. "He's never around when you want him." And that's the end of chapter 17.